A weary judge presides over a routine custody case until a tiny black girl tugs on his robe and whispers, "Mama gone." The room falls silent. Something about the way she says it chills him. He slams his gavel and orders 911, but when the police arrive, they hesitate. Someone powerful is pulling the strings. By day's end, the judge himself is warned, drop the case or face the consequences. Who is trying to silence him? What dark secret is being buried? And how far will he go to uncover the truth? Stay with us, because nothing is what it seems. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Judge Samuel Carter sat in his familiar leather chair, the morning sun casting long shadows through the high windows of courtroom 3B. His weathered hands rested on the smooth wooden surface of the bench where he had presided over thousands of cases during his 30-year career. Today felt different, though. There was an unsettling heaviness in the air, a tension that made even the familiar creak of his chair seem ominous. The small figure of Alani Monroe caught his attention immediately. She sat quietly beside her foster mother, her feet dangling far above the floor, her brown eyes carrying a depth of sadness that made Samuel's heart ache. Her pink dress seemed too crisp, too new, like it had been bought just for this occasion. He had seen countless children in his courtroom, but something about this little girl's demeanor struck him deeply, stirring memories of his own granddaughter. Brenda Wexley, the foster mother, sat ramrod straight in her chair. Her perfectly pressed blazer and meticulously styled hair seemed almost too perfect, like a photograph from a magazine. The pearl necklace at her throat caught the morning light with an artificial gleam. Samuel noticed how she barely glanced at Alani, keeping her hands folded precisely in her lap, her French manicured nails tapping silently against her knee. Karen Fields, the social worker, shuffled through her minimal paperwork, her face showing the weariness of someone carrying too many cases and too little time. Her coffee-stained sleeve and crooked name badge told their own story of overwhelm. Beside her, Jonathan Ames adjusted his expensive tie, checking his gold watch with poorly concealed impatience, his designer suit a stark contrast to Karen's worn blazer. "Let's proceed with case number 2023 FC428, Samuel announced, his voice carrying the authority of decades on the bench, though his throat felt unusually dry. Petition for full custody of Alani Monroe. As he opened the case file, his brow furrowed, deep lines etching across his forehead. The thin manila folder contained barely enough papers to justify its existence, the edges suspiciously crisp for a file that should have been handled by multiple agencies. In his experience, custody cases came with thick files, medical histories, background checks, home studies, school records. This one was practically empty, with several standard forms conspicuously absent. "Ms. Fields," Samuel said, looking over his reading glasses, the fluorescent lights reflecting off the wire frames. "Could you explain the circumstances that brought Alani into Ms. Wexley's care?" Karen Fields cleared her throat, her fingers nervously straightening the papers before her. "Yes, Your Honor. Approximately 6 months ago, Alani's biological mother abandoned her. Ms. Wexley was approved as a foster parent and has provided a stable home environment since then." Her voice wavered slightly on the word, abandoned. Samuel noticed how Karen's eyes darted away as she spoke, focusing on a spot just above his left shoulder. After 3 decades of watching witnesses, he had developed a keen sense for when someone wasn't telling the whole truth. The slight tremor in her hands didn't escape his notice either. "And the mother's whereabouts?" he pressed, leaning forward slightly in his chair. "Unknown, Your Honor," Karen replied, shuffling through her sparse papers, a slight sheen of sweat visible on her forehead. She left no forwarding address." Jonathan Ames stood up, straightening his suit jacket with a practiced flourish. "Your Honor, given the abandonment and Ms. Wexley's exemplary care, we're requesting an expedited ruling on full custody today." His confident tone carried a hint of condescension that made Samuel's jaw tighten. Samuel turned his attention to Brenda Wexley, studying her carefully manicured appearance. "Ms. Wexley, please tell the court how you came to foster Alani." Brenda's response came out smooth and practiced, like a speech rehearsed in front of a mirror, her hands gesturing with calculated precision. I've always wanted to help children in need. When I learned about Alani's situation, I knew I could provide her with a loving home. I have a 4-bedroom house in a good school district, a stable income, and I've completed all required foster parent training. Each word seemed polished to a shine, devoid of genuine emotion. Too perfect, Samuel thought, his stomach knotting with unease. Too rehearsed. Something wasn't adding up, and his decades of experience were screaming at him to dig deeper. He leaned forward, his attention fully on Alani now. Her small hands gripped the edge of her chair, knuckles white with tension, her patent leather shoes swinging nervously beneath her. "Alani," he said gently, softening his voice to the tone he used with his own grandchildren. "Do you like living with Ms. Wexley?" The courtroom fell silent, the usual shuffle of papers and whispered conversations completely still. Alani's eyes darted briefly to Brenda before returning to Samuel, fear flickering across her young face. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she shook her head, her dark curls barely moving with the motion. Samuel felt the weight of his gavel in his hand, his mind racing through decades of legal precedent and procedure. The worn wood felt warm against his palm, familiar yet somehow inadequate for the gravity of the moment. But before he could speak, he felt it, a small tug on his black robe. Looking down, he found Alani standing there, her tiny frame barely reaching the bench, her fingers twisted in the thick fabric. Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, 2 words that made time stand still. "Mama gone." The words hung in the air like smoke, carrying with them an unmistakable weight of desperation and plea for help. Samuel's grip tightened on his gavel, the smooth wood pressing into his palm as the weight of those 2 simple words filled the courtroom with unspoken questions. The morning sun had shifted, casting shadows that seemed darker and more ominous than before. Samuel's heart thundered in his chest as Alani's tiny fingers clung to his black robe, her small knuckles white with desperation. Those 2 whispered words, "Mama gone," echoed in his mind like a warning bell, haunting and insistent. After 40 years on the bench, he'd learned to trust his instincts, and they'd never screamed louder than they did now. Right now, every fiber of his being told him that something was terribly, horrifyingly wrong. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the wood-paneled walls as he studied Brenda Wexley's face. Her expression remained blank, almost bored, as if a child hadn't just implied something sinister. That unnatural calmness, that practiced indifference made his skin crawl and his stomach churn. "Your Honor," Jonathan Ames cut in, his voice sharp with irritation, his expensive suit rustling as he shifted in his chair. "This is highly irregular. We should proceed with—" Samuel's gavel crashed down with a bang that made everyone jump, the sound reverberating through the tense courtroom. "Bailiff, call 911 now." The words had barely left his mouth when the courtroom erupted into chaos. Jonathan Ames leaped to his feet, his face red with anger, his perfectly knotted tie quivering. "This is outrageous. You have no grounds." "I have every ground," Samuel's voice boomed across the room, filling every corner with authority. "And I suggest you sit down, counselor, before you find yourself in contempt." Karen Field started stammering, her earlier professional demeanor crumbling like a sandcastle in the rain. "Judge Carter, please, this isn't necessary. I can assure you." But Samuel's attention was fixed on Brenda Wexley. For the first time, her perfect composure cracked like thin ice. Her fingers twitched against the wooden table, and something dark and dangerous flashed behind her eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared. Within minutes, 2 uniformed officers entered the courtroom, their boots squeaking against the polished floor. Samuel expected immediate action, but they hesitated at the door, shifting uncomfortably like guilty schoolchildren. The taller officer's eyes darted to Karen Fields, and Samuel caught their silent exchange, loaded with unspoken meaning. Officer Derek Nolan, the bailiff Samuel had known for years, leaned in close enough that Samuel could smell his morning coffee. "Sir, are you sure about this?" His whispered words carried an edge of warning that made Samuel's neck prickle with foreboding. "I said," Samuel repeated firmly, placing a protective hand on Alani's trembling shoulder, "take this child into protective custody. Now." He felt the little girl shaking beneath his touch, her fear palpable through the thin fabric of her dress. The first officer gave his partner a subtle headshake, a warning gesture that sent alarm bells ringing in Samuel's head, their chime growing louder with each passing second. Police officers didn't hesitate like this, not when a child's safety was at stake, not unless something far more sinister was at play. The second officer stepped forward, but instead of approaching Alani, he moved closer to the bench, his badge catching the harsh fluorescent light. Samuel could smell coffee and mint gum on his breath as the man leaned in and whispered, "Judge, this case is above your pay grade." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow, leaving him momentarily breathless. In his 4 decades of service, through countless cases and challenges, no one had ever dared to challenge his authority so blatantly in his own courtroom. He straightened his spine, drawing himself up to his full height, fixing the officer with a hard stare that had made hardened criminals confess. "Who sent you?" The question came out low and dangerous, each word weighted with 40 years of judicial authority. The officer's response was equally quiet, but it landed like a bomb in Samuel's ears, shattering his world. "Senator Richard Callaway." Samuel felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him lightheaded. The name explained everything: the missing paperwork, the rushed hearing, the cooperative police, the whole corrupt tableau playing out before him. Richard Callaway, the man whose influence reached into every dark corner of state politics, whose name was whispered in courthouse hallways with equal parts fear and reverence, whose power could make evidence disappear and witnesses change their stories overnight. Samuel's office felt smaller than usual as he sat behind his mahogany desk, his fingers drumming an anxious rhythm on its worn surface. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the Venetian blinds, casting prison bar shadows across his worried face. The morning's events played over and over in his mind like a broken record. Alani's frightened whisper, the officer's strange behavior, and that name, Senator Richard Callaway. "Rebecca," he called out, his voice carrying through the open door. His clerk appeared immediately, her tablet clutched to her chest like a shield. Her usually neat bun was coming loose, wisps of gray hair framing her concerned expression. "I need you to pull everything we have on Alani Monroe's case. Every document, every form, every scrap of paper." Rebecca shifted uncomfortably, her usual efficiency replaced by hesitation. Her fingers tightened around the tablet until her knuckles went white. "Sir, they're sealed." She wouldn't meet his eyes, instead focusing on a spot just over his left shoulder. Samuel's hand came down hard on the desk, making his coffee mug rattle and spill a few drops onto scattered papers. "By whom?" Rebecca walked forward slowly, her sensible shoes barely making a sound on the carpet. She placed a thin manila folder on his desk, her hand lingering on it as if reluctant to let go. The black stamp across its cover made his blood run cold. "Confidential. Ordered sealed." With trembling fingers, he reached for his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. After 3 rings, a gruff voice answered, accompanied by the distant sounds of police radio chatter. "This better be important, Sam?" Detective James Keller's familiar drawl brought a small measure of comfort, like an old leather jacket that still fits. Samuel leaned back in his chair, his voice low and urgent. The leather creaked beneath him as he shifted his weight. "James, I need your help. I've got a 6-year-old girl whose mother vanished 6 months ago. The foster mother's story doesn't add up. The social worker's acting strange, and when I tried to intervene, 2 officers mentioned Senator Callaway." A long pause followed, filled only by the sound of Keller's heavy breathing. "Damn," Keller muttered, the word carrying the weight of years of experience with corruption. "I'll look into the mother, but if Callaway is involved, be careful. That man's got fingers in every pie in the city, and they all come back dirty." After hanging up, Samuel paced his office, wearing a path in the carpet. His reflection in the window showed a man he barely recognized, tired eyes, loosened tie, worry lines deepening with each step. The pieces were there, but he couldn't quite fit them together. Brenda Wexley's perfect answers, the police officer's reluctance to help, Callaway's name dropping like a threat. He tried calling Judge Thompson, then Judge Martinez, even Judge Chen. No one picked up. Their voicemails clicked one after another like dominoes falling. The silence felt orchestrated, deliberate, a wall of resistance building around him. The sun had long since set when Samuel finally gathered his things to head home. His bones ached with exhaustion as he climbed the stairs to his empty house, the events of the day weighing heavily on his shoulders. The porch light cast eerie shadows across his front lawn, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. He had just settled into his favorite armchair, the leather worn smooth from years of use, when his phone rang. The screen showed a blocked number, its blue light harsh in the dimly lit room. Against his better judgment, he answered, "Hello?" The voice that came through was slow, deliberate, each word carefully chosen, like ice forming on a winter morning. "You're stepping on the wrong toes, Judge Carter. Retire gracefully. This isn't your fight." The line went dead before he could respond, leaving him alone with the quiet hum of his house and the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. The growing certainty that he'd stumbled onto something far more dangerous than a simple custody case settled over him like a heavy blanket, suffocating in its weight. The early morning light crept through Samuel's kitchen window, casting long shadows across his worn wooden table. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten in his tight grip as he stared at the stack of notes he'd made throughout the sleepless night. Dark circles rimmed his eyes, but determination burned bright within them. The scattered papers before him told a story of corruption that seemed to grow more tangled with each passing hour. His cell phone buzzed against the table, making him jump. Detective Keller's name flashed on the screen, the bright display piercing the dim kitchen. "Sam here," he answered, his voice rough from lack of sleep and too much coffee. "Sam." Keller's voice crackled with urgency. "I found something. Been up all night digging. Had to call in some old favors for this one." Samuel sat straighter, reaching for his pen, his heart beginning to race. "Tell me." "Yasmin Monroe, Alani's mother. She didn't just disappear. Last time anyone saw her, she was raising hell at Harland Construction. Apparently they'd stiffed her and about 20 other cleaners on 6 weeks' worth of wages. She was organizing them, threatening to go to the labor board." "Harland Construction?" Samuel's pen stopped moving, his knuckles whitening around it. "Vincent Harland's company?" "The very same. And here's where it gets interesting. Harland's got his fingers in every major development project in the city. But guess who approves all his permits? Who sits on the Urban Development Committee and signs off on every contract? Callaway." Samuel breathed, a chill running down his spine. "Bingo. These guys are tight, Sam. Campaign contributions, private meetings, the works. Harland's dumped millions into Callaway's re-election fund through various shell companies." Samuel pushed back from the table, pacing his kitchen floor, the hardwood creaking beneath his feet. His mind raced, trying to connect the dots. A missing mother, a construction magnate, a powerful senator. It seemed too big, too complicated for a simple custody case. The morning light caught dust motes dancing in the air, making them look like fragments of a puzzle waiting to be solved. "But why?" Samuel muttered, running a hand through his silver hair. "Why would they care about one cleaning lady?" "Maybe she saw something she wasn't supposed to see," Keller suggested, his voice dropping lower. "Look, I've got to go. Watch your back, Sam. These aren't people who play nice." The line went dead, leaving Samuel alone with his thoughts and the weight of growing dread. He showered quickly and dressed for court, his mind churning with possibilities as he knotted his tie with trembling fingers. At the courthouse, he spotted Brenda Wexley heading toward the elevator, her designer suit perfectly pressed, her stride confident. "Mrs. Wexley," he called out, his judicial authority evident in his tone. "A word in my chambers?" She followed him without protest, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. In his office, she sat primly in the leather chair across from his desk, her face a mask of practiced indifference. "Where's Yasmin Monroe?" Samuel asked directly, studying her face for any reaction. Brenda's expression didn't change, but her manicured fingers tightened slightly on her purse. "I wouldn't know, Your Honor. I'm just a foster mother trying to give a poor abandoned child a home." "Isn't that what the system is for?" "Cut the act," Samuel snapped, leaning forward. "What's your connection to Vincent Harland? Why are you really involved in this case?" For just a moment, so brief he almost missed it, something flickered in Brenda's eyes. Fear? Warning? But her voice remained steady, taking on an edge of steel. "You don't want to make enemies, Judge. Not these enemies." She stood smoothly, adjusting her perfectly pressed blazer with manicured hands that never trembled. Samuel watched her walk toward his office door, her smugness evident in every calculated step. Just before leaving, she turned back with a cold smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Some cases are better left alone for everyone's sake, especially yours." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Samuel alone with the weight of realization settling heavy in his chest. This wasn't about custody anymore. This was about something much darker, a cover-up that reached into the highest levels of power in the city. And somewhere at the center of it all was a little girl who just wanted her mother back, a pawn in a game played by people who saw human lives as nothing more than inconvenient obstacles to be removed. The early morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across Samuel's courtroom. His fingers traced the edge of his desk as he reviewed the emergency motion papers one last time, the familiar texture of the polished wood doing nothing to calm his nerves. The clock on the wall read 8:30 a.m., but his mind had been racing since dawn, rehearsing arguments and anticipating objections. Brenda Wexley sat in the front row, her posture perfect, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Her expensive pearl necklace caught the light as she shifted in her seat. Next to her, Jonathan Ames shuffled through his papers with sharp, aggressive movements, his starched collar already wilting in the stuffy courtroom air. Karen Fields perched nervously on the edge of her seat, her eyes darting between Samuel and Brenda, her social worker's badge hanging heavily around her neck. "Your Honor," Samuel began, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest, "I move for an emergency order to remove Alani Monroe from her current foster placement, based on serious concerns about her safety and well-being." The words felt thick in his throat, weighted with the urgency of what he couldn't yet prove. Jonathan Ames shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a clear abuse of judicial power. Judge Carter has shown concerning bias in this case." His voice filled the courtroom, bouncing off the wood-paneled walls, the theatrical outrage perfectly calculated. District Attorney Michael Reed sat quietly in the corner, his face carefully blank, his expensive suit a stark contrast to his hunched posture. Samuel caught his eye, but Reed quickly looked away, suddenly fascinated by his leather briefcase. The message was clear. He wouldn't find any help there. "Ms. Fields," the presiding judge called, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "What is your professional opinion on this matter?" Karen Fields stood slowly, her hands clasped tightly together, her wedding ring clicking against itself. I believe Alani is well cared for in her current placement." Her voice quivered slightly, like a leaf in autumn. "Mrs. Wexley has provided a stable home environment." Samuel watched Karen's trembling hands, noting how she wouldn't meet his eyes, how her shoulders curved inward protectively. Before he could press further, Jonathan Ames strode forward with a thick manila folder, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit new evidence regarding the biological mother's background." Ames pulled out document after document, laying them before the court with theatrical precision. Yasmin Monroe has multiple drug-related arrests. Hospital records show treatment for overdose. Witness statements confirm her criminal activities. Samuel's heart sank as he examined the papers, his trained eye catching subtle inconsistencies that wouldn't be obvious to others. They looked perfect. Too perfect. The signatures, the timestamps, the official letterheads, all flawless forgeries, he was certain. But he couldn't prove it. Not here. Not now. Not without more time and resources. The presiding judge reviewed the documents carefully, his weathered hands turning each page with methodical attention. "Given this new evidence and the stability of the current placement, I'm denying the emergency motion. Alani Monroe will remain in Mrs. Wexley's custody." Brenda's smirk widened as she gathered her things, her manicured nails clicking against her leather portfolio. Samuel glanced at Alani, sitting small and quiet in her chair, her purple backpack clutched tightly to her chest. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and the fear he saw there hit him like a physical blow, a silent plea that tore at his conscience. Later that night, Samuel sat in his parked car outside the courthouse, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, the leather creaking under his grip. The streetlights cast yellow circles on the empty parking lot, and for the first time in his long career, he felt completely powerless. The system he'd dedicated his life to had been turned against him, against a child who needed help. The weight of his failure pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. He couldn't fight this alone, not against Calloway, not against the network of influence that seemed to reach into every corner of the justice system. The taste of defeat was bitter in his mouth, but as he watched the shadows lengthen across the parking lot, he knew this wasn't over. It couldn't be. The streetlights cast long shadows as Samuel pulled up to Miriam Grayson's modest craftsman home. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his mind heavy with the day's defeat. The clock on his dashboard read 9:15 p.m., and a light drizzle had started to fall, dotting his windshield with tiny droplets. Miriam's porch light flickered as he approached, moths dancing around the yellow glow. The worn wooden steps creaked under his feet as he climbed them. He knocked twice, hearing shuffling inside. The door opened just enough for Miriam's sharp eyes to assess him, her silver hair catching the dim light. "Sam, what brings you here at this hour?" Her voice was rough from years of smoking, but her mind was still razor sharp. The scent of coffee and old books wafted from behind her. "I need your help, Miriam." He held up the case files, their edges dampened by the rain. "It's about a little girl." She sighed, opening the door wider. Her living room was cluttered with legal books and old case files, a testament to decades fighting in courtrooms. A half-empty coffee mug sat on a stack of law journals. "Come in, but make it quick. Some of us actually try to sleep at night." Samuel spread the documents across her coffee table, careful not to disturb the organized chaos of her workspace. Alani Monroe, age 6, mother missing, possibly murdered. Foster mother connected to Senator Calloway. Look at this. He handed her the falsified drug report, its pages crisp and official looking. They created an entire criminal history for the mother overnight. Miriam's eyes narrowed as she scanned the papers, leaning forward in her worn leather armchair. Her fingers, stained slightly yellow from cigarettes, traced the signatures. When she reached Vincent Harland's name, she froze, her breath catching audibly. "Harland?" She set the paper down carefully as if it might bite. "That bastard's still around? You know him?" "Know him?" Miriam reached for her cigarettes, lighting one with practiced ease. Her hands trembled slightly with barely contained anger. "I spent 3 years trying to nail him for labor trafficking. Immigrant workers mostly. They'd disappear when they complained about conditions or wages." She took a long drag, the ember glowing bright in the dim room. Just like Alani's mother. Samuel leaned forward, his tie loosened and collar rumpled from the long day. "Tell me everything." It was ugly, Sam. Workers vanishing, records destroyed, witnesses scared silent. Smoke curled around her face like a ghostly veil. But Harland had protection. Now I know from whom. She tapped the senator's name on the document, leaving a smudge from her fingertip. "Will you help me, Miriam? I can't fight this alone." His voice carried the weight of decades on the bench, seeing justice bend to power. She stood, pacing the room, cigarette burning between her fingers. Her shadow danced on the walls lined with law books. "You realize what you're asking? Going after Calloway isn't like your usual cases. He destroys people, careers, families, lives, they all disappear." "I know." "If we do this, we don't do it quietly," she warned, turning to face him with fierce determination. "We hit hard, we hit public, and we don't stop until it's done, no matter what it costs us." Samuel nodded, his jaw set. "Where do we start?" Miriam stubbed out her cigarette and picked up her phone, her movements precise and purposeful. I know someone. Old reporter. Keeps dirt on everyone. Never published the Harlan story, but kept the evidence. She dialed, her expression hardening with determination. The rain outside had picked up, drumming against the windows. Samuel watched her, this fierce woman he'd known for decades, coming back to life for one more fight. She'd sworn she was done with these battles, yet here she was, diving back in. Her hands had stopped shaking, replaced by the steady certainty of a warrior preparing for battle. "Jack?" She spoke into the phone, her voice carrying the authority of her courtroom days. "It's Miriam. Remember that file you had on Vincent Harlan? I need it. All of it. Every dirty secret, every connection, every piece of evidence you couldn't print." Samuel pushed open the heavy courthouse doors, the morning sun barely peeking over the horizon. His footsteps echoed through the empty marble hallway as he made his way to his office, his mind already racing with strategies for the day ahead. The familiar scent of lemon polish and old wood filled his nostrils, a smell that had meant justice to him for over 2 decades. The first thing he noticed was Rebecca Hayes standing by his door, wringing her hands. Her face was ghost white, and she couldn't meet his eyes. A stack of files trembled in her grip. "Judge Carter," she whispered, "there's something on your desk." Inside his office, a cream-colored envelope sat in the center of his polished oak desk. The official courthouse seal glared up at him like an accusation. With steady hands that betrayed none of the anger building inside him, Samuel picked it up and read the contents. The words, "Administrative suspension," jumped out at him in bold letters, each one feeling like a personal betrayal. "They can't do this," Rebecca said, her voice trembling. Her fingers twisted the edge of her cardigan. "They can't just—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "They're forcing you out, Judge Carter." Samuel was about to respond when a familiar figure appeared in his doorway. Judge Henry Hensley, his friend of 20 years, stood there looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. His normally pristine suit was slightly rumpled, and dark circles ringed his eyes. His shoulders sagged with an invisible weight. "Sam," Hensley said quietly, "we need to talk." Rebecca excused herself, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Hensley sank into one of the leather chairs facing Samuel's desk, the leather creaking under his weight. "This isn't a fight you can win," Hensley said, rubbing his temples. His wedding ring caught the morning light. "This case is bigger than you, Sam. The people involved, they don't play by the rules we do. They'll crush you without thinking twice." Samuel leaned forward, his voice low but firm. The family photos on his desk seemed to watch him. "If I walk away, what happens to that girl?" "Then you'll lose everything," Hensley replied, spreading his hands. His voice carried genuine concern. "Your career, your pension, your reputation, all of it. Gone. Just like that." A quick knock at the door interrupted them. Rebecca poked her head in, her face even paler than before. Her hands shook as she gripped the doorframe. "Judge Carter, I just tried to access Alani's case files. They're gone. Everything's being purged from the system. It's like they never existed." Samuel felt his jaw tighten. They were erasing the evidence, making it disappear as if Alani Monroe had never existed, as if her mother had never vanished, as if none of it had ever happened. The morning sun streaming through his window suddenly felt cold. Hensley stood up, straightening his tie with practiced precision. "Be smart about this, Sam. Walk away while you still can. Don't throw away everything you've worked for." Samuel picked up the suspension notice, folded it carefully, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. His voice was steel when he spoke. "They think they can silence me? They're wrong. Dead wrong." Without another word, he grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door. The weight of decades of service to justice pressed down on his shoulders, but his steps were determined. He knew exactly where he needed to go. Miriam would know what to do next. She always did. Rebecca watched him leave, tears gathering in her eyes. Hensley shook his head slowly, watching through the window as his old friend strode across the courthouse lawn, knowing his old friend had just declared war on forces far more powerful than himself. The morning sun cast long shadows behind Samuel as he walked away from everything he'd ever known. Samuel stood in Miriam's cramped office, surrounded by towering stacks of yellowed files and dog-eared legal books. The morning light filtered through dusty blinds, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. The air smelled of old paper and coffee, a scent that had become synonymous with their long hours of investigation. Miriam hunched over her desk, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she rifled through papers with fierce determination, her silver hair catching the dim light. "Sam, look at this," she said, holding up a document. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. "The lab that supposedly tested Yasmin Monroe? Advanced Medical Testing Services? It doesn't exist. I called every medical board in the state. It's completely fake. Not a single registration, not even a business license." Samuel leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What else? The officer who signed off on the drug report?" Miriam pulled out another paper, spreading it flat on her cluttered desk. "Officer James Mitchell. Guess who he's connected to? 3 different companies that donated to Callaway's last campaign. Shell companies, all of them, created just months before the donations." Samuel sank into a creaky chair, running his hands over his face. The weight of corruption pressed down on his shoulders. "And Brenda?" Miriam's eyes lit up as she grabbed another file, nearly knocking over her cold cup of coffee in her excitement. "That's where it gets interesting. I found 6 separate wire transfers from Harlan Development to her personal account, each for exactly $25,000. The first one? The day before Alani came into her care. They didn't even try to hide it." "They bought her," Samuel said quietly, his stomach turning. "They literally bought her to take that child." The words tasted bitter in his mouth. "Exactly." Miriam stood up, pacing the small space between filing cabinets, her sensible shoes making soft sounds on the carpet. "Sam, you need to go public with this. They've already suspended you. What more can they take? Your reputation, they're already trying to destroy that." Samuel stared at his hands, noticing how old they looked in the morning light. Throughout his career, he'd always worked within the system, believing in its power to deliver justice. The thought of fighting against it felt wrong, like betraying an old friend. Every case he'd presided over, every oath he'd taken seemed to whisper warnings in his ear. "I don't know, Miriam, if we do this wrong." "Wrong?" Miriam's voice rose, echoing off the walls of her small office. "There's a little girl out there who lost her mother, and these people are covering it up. There is no wrong way to expose this." She reached for her phone, her movements quick and decisive. "I'm calling Rachel DeWitt." "The journalist?" Samuel straightened up, his chair protesting. "Miriam, wait." But she was already dialing, her fingers flying over the keypad. "Rachel? It's Miriam Grayson. Remember that favor you owe me? I'm calling it in." She paused, listening, her free hand drumming impatiently on her desk. "No, this is bigger than anything I've brought you before. We're talking corruption at the highest level." Samuel watched as Miriam's face hardened with determination. She gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles white against the black plastic. Her eyes had the same intensity he remembered from their law school days when she'd argue cases until her voice gave out. "This isn't just a custody battle, Rachel. It's a cover-up at the highest level. We have proof of bribery, falsified documents, and connections leading straight to Senator Callaway's office. The kind of story that could shake the whole system." She locked eyes with Samuel as she spoke, and he saw the same fire that had made her legendary in civil rights cases decades ago. The look that had made corrupt officials squirm and juries lean forward in their seats. She wasn't just fighting. She was ready for war, and deep down, Samuel knew there was no turning back now. The cafe's dim lighting cast long shadows across the worn wooden tables. Samuel's fingers drummed nervously against his coffee cup as Rachel DeWitt studied the documents spread before her. Her dark-rimmed glasses couldn't hide the sharp intelligence in her eyes as she examined each piece of evidence, her forehead creasing with each new revelation. "This is extensive," Rachel said, her voice low and measured. She picked up the financial records linking Brenda Wexley to Harlan's company, spreading them out like a gruesome fan. Regular payments, all just under the reporting threshold. They weren't even trying to hide it well. It's like they were daring someone to notice. Miriam leaned forward, her silver hair catching the weak light from the window. The late afternoon sun painted stark lines across her determined face. They didn't think anyone would look closely enough to notice. That's how arrogant they've become. They've gotten away with it for so long they think they're untouchable. Rachel spread out the falsified drug test results and police reports, her fingers tracing the inconsistencies. Her practiced eye caught details others might miss. These signatures? They're all from officers connected to Calloway's campaign donors. She looked up at Samuel, her pen tapping thoughtfully against her notepad. How did you piece this together? Samuel's voice was heavy with the weight of what they'd uncovered. His coffee had grown cold, forgotten in the gravity of their discussion. One thread at a time. The thin case file, the rushed hearing, the police officers who wouldn't help. It all pointed to something bigger. Each dead end led to another connection. This isn't just about one child anymore, Rachel said, arranging the documents into neat piles with practiced precision. This is systematic. The fake drug charges, the manufactured evidence, the strategic placement of vulnerable children. She paused, her expression hardening as the full picture emerged. This is human trafficking, coordinated at the highest levels. They've built an entire network right under our noses. Samuel felt his stomach turn. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it stated so plainly made it real in a way that shook him to his core. The coffee cup in his hands suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. If I publish this, Rachel continued, her tone deadly serious as she leaned closer, lowering her voice even further, there will be immediate backlash. Calloway has friends in every major institution. The retaliation will be swift and merciless. She fixed Samuel with a steady gaze that held both warning and concern. Are you absolutely sure you're ready for that? Samuel hesitated. His suspension notice felt heavy in his pocket, a constant reminder of what he'd already lost. His life's work, his reputation, everything he'd built. It could all crumble. The thought made his hands shake slightly as he set down his cup. Miriam's hand slammed down on the table, making their coffee cups rattle against their saucers. The few other cafe patrons glanced their way before quickly looking away. They've already suspended him. They've already tried to silence us. Her eyes blazed with determination, the fire of righteous anger burning bright. What else do they have to do before you realize this fight isn't optional, Sam? Samuel looked at the small photo of Alani that had been paper-clipped to her case file. Those sad brown eyes seemed to peer into his soul, asking silently for help. His hesitation melted away like morning frost in the sun. Do it, he said firmly, his voice finding new strength. Run the story. All of it. Rachel nodded, gathering the documents carefully into her briefcase with methodical precision. I have contacts in the governor's office and trusted law enforcement officials. I'll reach out to them before this goes live. We'll need all the support we can get. This storm won't be weathered alone. They stood up. The meeting concluded. Rachel's heels clicked against the cafe's wooden floor as she headed for the door, each step purposeful and determined. Samuel and Miriam followed, stepping out into the afternoon sun that seemed too bright for such dark revelations. Across the street, a black sedan sat idling, its engine a low, menacing purr. The windows were tinted, but Samuel could feel eyes watching their every move, cataloging their actions. He exchanged a knowing look with Miriam, whose jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. They were being followed, and they both knew it. The stakes had just been raised, and there would be no turning back now. The harsh morning light filtered through Samuel's kitchen window as he sat at his table, hands wrapped around his untouched coffee. The ceramic mug had gone cold, but he barely noticed. Sleep had been elusive, his mind racing with strategies and worries about Alani's case until dawn painted the sky. The sudden banging at his front door made him jump, sloshing coffee onto the worn wooden table. His heart pounding against his ribs, Samuel approached cautiously. Through the peephole, he saw no one, just his empty front porch bathed in morning light. When he opened the door, the sight hit him like a physical blow. Bright red paint dripped down his white door, spelling out "Drop it" in angry, messy letters. The paint had splattered onto his welcome mat and concrete steps, looking like blood in the early sun. His phone rang, making him flinch. Detective Keller's name flashed on the screen and Samuel's stomach tightened with dread. "Sam, you need to hear this." Keller's voice was tight with concern, barely above a whisper. "Internal Affairs just opened an investigation into you. They're saying you took bribes throughout your career. They've been working on this for weeks." Samuel's legs felt weak. He sank into his worn leather armchair, the one he'd sat in countless times while reviewing cases. "That's ridiculous. My record is clean. 40 years on the bench. They can check every ruling. It doesn't matter. They're building a case. Old cases are being reviewed. Witnesses are coming forward claiming you accepted payments for favorable rulings." Keller paused, his breath heavy on the line. "It's a smear campaign, Sam, but it's thorough. They've got fake paper trails, doctored bank statements, everything." As if on cue, Samuel's TV started flashing breaking news alerts. The headline made his stomach turn. "Disgraced judge under investigation for corruption." His own face stared back at him from the screen. His cell phone buzzed again, his attorney this time, voice clipped with urgency. "Samuel, stay home. Don't talk to anyone. This is serious. They're moving fast." But worse news was coming. Through his police contacts, Keller learned that Alani had been removed from Brenda's home, only to be placed in a state facility on the outskirts of town. When Samuel tried to check on her, a stern-faced administrator with cold eyes blocked his path, standing like a sentinel at her office door. "You have no authority here," she said coldly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Please leave before we call security. We're aware of the investigation." Brenda Wexley had vanished completely, her house empty, her phone disconnected. The curtains hung limp in the windows, and newspapers were beginning to pile up on the front step. It was as if she'd never existed. Miriam called next, her voice sharp with anger and determination. "They're trying to make her disappear, Sam. Just like her mother. They want to erase her completely. We can't let them win." Samuel stood in his living room watching the news coverage of his supposed corruption. His face appeared on screen, an old photo where he looked stern and unapproachable, carefully selected to make him look guilty. The reporter spoke of allegations spanning decades and possible criminal charges, their voices dripping with barely concealed judgment. He switched off the TV with trembling fingers, his jaw set firmly. They thought they could scare him away with paint and lies. They thought they could bury the truth under false accusations and bureaucratic roadblocks. They thought wrong, but they were wrong. Samuel Carter hadn't spent 40 years serving justice to back down now. Not when a little girl's life hung in the balance. Not when the whole system was revealed to be this corrupt. Not when he could still do something about it. He picked up his phone and dialed Miriam's number, his resolve hardening with each ring. They had work to do, and time was running out. The night air was crisp and cold as Samuel pulled into the empty parking lot behind the abandoned warehouse. His headlights swept across broken windows and graffiti-covered walls before he killed the engine, plunging everything into darkness. The distant hum of traffic was the only sound as he checked his rearview mirror repeatedly, making sure no one had followed him. His fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel as he waited. Detective Keller's unmarked car rolled in silently a few minutes later, parking beside him. The gravel crunched under their feet as both men stepped out, their breath forming small clouds in the chilly air. The smell of rust and decay from the old building hung heavy around them. "Thanks for meeting me," Keller said quietly, glancing around at the shadows between the buildings. "We need to make this quick. These walls have eyes these days." Samuel nodded, his hands deep in his coat pockets to ward off the cold that seemed to seep into his bones. "What did you find?" "Something big." Keller pulled out a folded piece of paper, his hands shaking slightly. Whether from cold or nerves, Samuel couldn't tell. "There's a Jane Doe at St. Mary's Hospital, admitted 3 weeks ago. The description matches Yasmin Monroe perfectly. Height, age, even the small scar on her left temple. The nurse's notes are detailed." Samuel's heart started racing, hope rising in his chest for the first time in weeks. "She's alive?" "Looks that way. But here's the thing. She was admitted under suspicious circumstances. Found unconscious near the industrial district. No ID, no belongings." Keller's voice dropped lower, barely above a whisper, And get this, the responding officers, same ones who showed up in your courtroom that day, Crawford and Martinez. Samuel took the paper with trembling fingers, the hospital address scrawled in Keller's messy handwriting. The implications made his stomach turn. Sam, listen to me carefully. Keller grabbed his arm, his grip tight with urgency. If anyone catches you looking into this, I can't help you. My hands are already tied. They're watching me too now. I've got guys following me home, checking my phone records. I understand. Samuel carefully folded the paper and tucked it into his inner coat pocket, close to his heart. Back home, he called Miriam immediately, pacing his living room as the phone rang. Despite the late hour, she answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting. We found her, Miriam. Yasmin might be alive. There was a sharp intake of breath, then silence. Are you sure? It's not. Keller found her. We need to move fast if we can get her to testify. It would blow everything wide open, Miriam finished, her voice tight with controlled excitement. Give me the details. Every single thing you know. They spent the next hour planning, going over every possibility and pitfall. Miriam would contact Rachel DeWitt, a trusted nurse practitioner, to quietly investigate the hospital records. They needed absolute proof it was really Yasmin before making any moves. One wrong step could alert Calloway's people. The next morning, fighting exhaustion from a sleepless night, Samuel made one last attempt to see Alani. He drove to the state facility, hoping to at least confirm she was safe. The building loomed gray and forbidding in the morning light, but a burly security officer, his badge gleaming importantly on his chest, stopped him at the entrance. She's being transferred, the man said flatly, his eyes cold and uninterested. Where? When? Samuel demanded, fighting to keep his voice steady. The officer's face remained expressionless like a stone wall. That information is restricted. You need to leave the premises, sir. Samuel stood in the facility's parking lot, his hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles turned white. In his pocket, the paper with the hospital address felt like it was burning a hole. They were running out of time. If they lost track of Alani now, she could disappear forever into the system. He pulled out the paper and read the address again. St. Mary's Hospital, 1242 Westbrook Avenue. The ink was slightly smudged from his sweaty fingers. It was their only lead, their only chance to unravel this whole conspiracy before it swallowed more lives. He just prayed they weren't too late. The weight of what they were up against pressed down on his shoulders as he walked back to his car, more determined than ever. The hospital loomed before them like a shadow against the star-filled sky, its windows dark except for a few scattered lights that dotted the massive structure like tired eyes. Samuel's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. Beside him, Miriam checked her phone one last time before tucking it away in her coat pocket. Rachel's in position, Miriam whispered, her breath fogging in the cold air. She'll call if anyone suspicious shows up. She's got eyes on both entrances. They parked far from the main entrance where the security cameras had blind spots they'd carefully mapped out days before. The night air was cold and still, carrying the antiseptic smell of the hospital. Samuel's heart pounded against his ribs as they approached the building's side entrance, their shoes crunching softly on the frost-covered ground. Miriam straightened her jacket and walked in first, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor with practiced confidence. The night nurse looked up from her desk, tired eyes narrowing as she studied the late-night visitors. "My sister," Miriam said, her voice trembling just enough to sound genuine, years of courtroom experience lending authenticity to her performance. "She went missing weeks ago. Someone said they saw her here. I've been searching everywhere." The nurse hesitated, her fingers hovering over her keyboard as she glanced between them. "We can't give out patient information," she said, but her voice held a note of uncertainty. "Please," Miriam begged, letting tears well up in her eyes. "Just tell me if she's here. That's all I need to know. I haven't slept in weeks." Something in Miriam's plea seemed to touch the nurse. She glanced down the empty hallway, then pointed toward a restricted wing, her conscience clearly winning over protocol. "Third floor. But you didn't hear it from me, and be quick about it." They took the stairs, avoiding the elevator cameras that would leave a digital trail of their presence. The restricted ward was eerily quiet, their footsteps echoing despite their attempts to move silently across the worn floor tiles. Samuel's judicial badge got them through one locked door, then another, the magnetic strips releasing with soft clicks that seemed thunderous in the silence. Room 317 was dimly lit by a single monitoring screen that cast a bluish glow across the space. Samuel's breath caught in his throat as they entered. There, lying still in the hospital bed, was a woman he recognized from the case files he'd studied countless times, Yasmin Monroe. Her face was thinner than in her photos, her skin pale as paper, but it was unmistakably her. "Dear God," Miriam muttered, checking the IV drip with practiced eyes. "They've been keeping her sedated. Heavy doses, too. No wonder no one's heard from her." Samuel approached the bed carefully, his heart aching at the sight of her vulnerable form. "Yasmin," he whispered, touching her hand gently. "Yasmin, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered like trapped butterflies but didn't open. A small moan escaped her lips, but the drugs kept her under, locked away from the world. Suddenly, a sharp alarm pierced the silence, making them both jump. Red lights began flashing in the hallway, painting the walls in pulses of crimson. "Security breach," a voice called over the intercom, crackling with urgency. "Third floor, restricted wing. All units respond." "Run!" Miriam grabbed Samuel's arm, pulling him toward the door. They raced down the hallway as heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs, growing closer with each second. They burst through the emergency exit, the alarm blaring behind them like an angry hornet. Rachel's car screeched up to the curb, tires squealing against the pavement. "Get in!" she shouted through the open window, her face tight with fear. They dove into the back seat just as security guards burst through the door behind them, their shouts lost in the night air. Rachel hit the gas, and they sped away into the darkness, leaving only tire marks as evidence of their presence. Samuel looked back at the hospital growing smaller in the distance, its lights now blazing like angry eyes. His chest ached with a physical pain, knowing they were leaving Yasmin behind in that sterile prison. Miriam's face was grim in the darkness, her jaw set with determination. "They were keeping her hidden," she said, her voice tight with anger and purpose. "We just kicked the hornet's nest. And you know what? It's about time somebody did." The early morning sun barely filtered through Miriam's living room windows as Samuel paced back and forth, his shoes wearing a path in her faded carpet. Coffee cups littered the table, evidence of their sleepless night, some still half full with cold coffee. Rachel sat cross-legged on the floor, her laptop balanced on her knees, fingers flying over the keyboard as she searched through document after document. "There has to be something we missed," Samuel muttered, running his hand through his disheveled gray hair. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed his exhaustion, but determination kept him moving. Miriam was about to respond when her phone rang. She grabbed it quickly, putting it on speaker. The device clattered against the wooden table. "Keller." "Alani's gone." Detective Keller's voice crackled with urgency through the speaker. "The facility claims she was transferred, but something's wrong. I can't find any record of where they took her. It's like she vanished into thin air. I've checked every database I have access to." Samuel's fist came down hard on the table, making the coffee cups rattle and splash. "They're hiding her, just like they tried to hide Yasmin." His voice trembled with barely contained fury. Rachel looked up from her laptop, her eyes bright with discovery. "Wait, I might have something." She turned the screen around, the blue light illuminating her tired face. "There's an unlisted facility on the outskirts of town. It's registered to a shell company, but I traced it back to one of Harlan's organizations. The paperwork's buried deep, but the connection is there." "Address?" Miriam was already grabbing her car keys, the metal jingling in her shaking hands. 20 minutes later, they pulled up to a plain brick building nestled between overgrown weeds and cracked concrete. No signs, no markings, just empty windows staring back at them like dead eyes. Samuel's stomach churned as they approached the entrance, the morning dew soaking through their shoes. The door wasn't even locked. It creaked open at their touch. Inside, the air was stale and cold, carrying the musty scent of abandonment. Their footsteps echoed through empty hallways as they searched room after room, calling out softly. Finally, they found what looked like a children's area. A single metal crib stood in the corner, surrounded by scattered blankets on the floor like autumn leaves. "They left in a hurry," Miriam observed, picking up a small pink blanket. Her fingers traced the worn edges, still warm from recent use. Samuel stood in the middle of the room, his hands shaking with rage. They're treating her like she's disposable, like she's property. His voice bounced off the bare walls, filling the empty space with his pain. Miriam's eyes hardened as she nodded. Then let's remind them she isn't. Her jaw set with fierce determination. In the corner of the room, something caught Samuel's eye. He walked over and picked up a small, worn teddy bear. Its fur was matted, one eye hanging loose by a thread. He held it tight, thinking of Alani's frightened face the last time he saw her in his courtroom, her tiny hands clutching the railing. The empty room seemed to mock them with its silence, the abandoned toys and blankets telling a story of children moved like pawns in someone else's game. Samuel's grip on the teddy bear tightened until his knuckles turned white, the stuffed animal a painful reminder of all they had yet to accomplish. The morning light streamed through the windows of Rachel's makeshift command center, a small but secure office space she borrowed from a trusted colleague. Computers hummed, papers scattered across tables, and coffee cups multiplied by the hour. Samuel stood by the window, his shoulders tense as he watched the city wake up. "Everything's ready," Rachel announced, her voice steady despite her evident exhaustion. "Once I hit send, every major network will have this story within minutes." Miriam looked up from her stack of documents, her reading glasses perched on her nose. "Sam, you need to understand what this means. The moment this goes public, they'll come at you with everything they've got." Samuel turned from the window, his jaw set. "They're coming for that little girl. I'm coming for them." Rachel's fingers hovered over her keyboard. With a decisive click, the story went live. Within 30 minutes, phones started ringing. Within an hour, social media exploded. "Foster child missing after judge exposes corruption" trended nationwide. Detective Keller called mid-morning, his voice low and urgent. "It's chaos at the department, Sam. Calloway's people are everywhere, making calls, issuing threats." The governor's office released a hasty statement. "We take these allegations seriously and are launching a full investigation." But it rang hollow, especially when Senator Calloway appeared on camera shortly after, his usual smooth demeanor cracking under pressure. "These accusations are completely unfounded," Calloway declared, but his trembling hands and darting eyes told a different story. Miriam burst into the room waving a paper. "Got it." Calloway's assistant booked a private jet 2 hours after Alani disappeared. She spread the flight manifest across the table. "Look who's on the passenger list, Brenda Wexley." Samuel's fingers traced the flight details, his face darkening. "They're taking her out of the country." Miriam met his gaze, determination burning in her eyes. "Then we stop them before they do." The room crackled with renewed energy as they gathered around the manifest, plotting their next move. Rachel's story had lit the fuse. Now they were racing against time to save Alani before she vanished forever. The afternoon sun beat down on the growing crowd outside City Hall. Samuel stood among the protesters, watching as their numbers swelled. Signs bobbed above heads. "Justice for Alani," "Stop child trafficking," "Expose Calloway." The energy was electric, charged with righteous anger and determination. Miriam appeared at his side, her eyes bright with renewed purpose. "Look at this, Sam. The whole city is waking up." Rachel weaved through the crowd toward them, her phone pressed to her ear. "CNN just picked it up. Fox News too. It's everywhere now." She showed them her screen, filled with breaking news alerts. "The governor can't ignore this anymore." The crowd's chants grew louder as more people joined. College students, parents, teachers, regular folks who'd been moved by Alani's story. Samuel felt a surge of hope watching them. This was what justice looked like, people standing together, refusing to let corruption win. His phone buzzed, Keller's number. "Sam," Keller's voice was urgent, "that jet?" "It's still on the ground at Harrison Private Airfield, scheduled for takeoff at midnight. But here's the thing. Brenda Wexley was seen entering the terminal 20 minutes ago. Samuel's heart raced. With Alani? Can't confirm. But there's movement. A lot of it. And Calloway's people are nervous. Miriam was already moving, pulling Samuel toward her car. We need to get there, now. As they sped toward the airfield, news helicopters circled overhead, tracking the story. Rachel's phone kept buzzing with updates. Calloway had disappeared from his mansion, leaving his PR team to face the media circus. Vincent Harland was spotted entering his lawyer's office, looking shaken. "Harland's cracking," Rachel reported from the back seat. "My sources say he's already reaching out to make a deal. He knows he's the easiest target." They pulled up to a side entrance of the airfield. Other cars were arriving too, black SUVs with federal plates. Men in suits emerged, speaking into earpieces. "FBI," Miriam whispered. They moved fast. Samuel watched from behind a hangar as agents approached the private jet. Its engines were already warming up, stairs deployed. Through the terminal windows, he could see movement, people arguing, gesturing frantically. The standoff was about to begin. Samuel gripped the chain-link fence, his knuckles white. Somewhere in that terminal was a little girl who needed him to get this right. The night air crackled with tension at the private airstrip. Red and blue lights from police vehicles painted the tarmac in alternating colors. Samuel's heart pounded as he watched FBI agents take their positions around the sleek private jet. Miriam stood beside him, her fingers digging into her palms. Special Agent Laura Chavez adjusted her bulletproof vest and spoke into her radio. "All units in position. Move in on my mark." She raised her hand, then dropped it sharply. "Go, go, go!" The agents rushed forward with precision, their movements practiced and swift. The jet's door burst open. Samuel held his breath, straining to see through the darkness. Shouts echoed across the tarmac. "FBI, get down! Hands where we can see them!" Brenda Wexley's voice rang out, shrill and desperate. "You can't do this. Do you know who I work for?" Two agents emerged, gripping Brenda's arms as she thrashed between them. Her perfectly styled hair had come undone, her composed facade cracking like thin ice. "Clear the main cabin," an agent called out, checking the back compartment. Seconds stretched like hours. Samuel's legs trembled with the effort of staying put. Then, "We've got her. Child secure." Miriam grabbed Samuel's arm, steadying him. Agent Chavez nodded, giving him permission to approach. He walked forward on shaky legs, climbing the jet's stairs. In the narrow aisle, an agent was kneeling beside a small figure huddled in the corner. Samuel dropped to his knees, his voice gentle. "Alani, it's over. You're safe now." The little girl lifted her head slowly, her brown eyes wide with fear and hope. She stared at him for a long moment, recognition dawning on her face. Then she scrambled forward, throwing herself into his arms with such force it nearly knocked him back. Outside, Brenda's voice rose in hysteria as agents led her to a waiting vehicle. "You don't know what you've done," she screamed, her words echoing across the airfield. "You have no idea." But Samuel barely heard her. He held Alani close, feeling her tiny fingers grip his shirt. News helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights illuminating the scene. The crowd that had gathered beyond the perimeter began to cheer as word spread. The little girl was safe. Agent Chavez approached, her expression softening. "We'll need to get her checked out at the hospital, but she appears unharmed." Samuel stood carefully, still cradling Alani. She refused to let go, and he had no intention of making her. He carried her down the jet's stairs as more agents swarmed the scene, collecting evidence and securing the area. Looking down at the child in his arms, Samuel spoke softly. "We're going home." Alani's grip loosened slightly, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she smiled. A small, tentative thing, but real. It was the most beautiful sight Samuel had ever seen. The fluorescent lights of the FBI briefing room buzzed overhead as Samuel rubbed his tired eyes. It was barely dawn, but the room hummed with activity. Agents moved purposefully, carrying files and speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Special Agent Laura Chavez stood at the front of the room, pinning photos to an evidence board. Brenda Wexley's in Interrogation Room 3, Chavez announced, her voice crisp and professional. She's already asking for a deal. Miriam snorted, her arms crossed. Let her squirm, she knows she's finished. Through the observation window, Samuel watched Brenda fidget in her chair. Her designer clothes were wrinkled, her makeup smeared. Gone was the cold, composed woman who had sat in his courtroom just days ago. I want protection, Brenda's voice crackled through the speakers. If I talk, they'll kill me. The FBI interrogator leaned forward. Who's they, Mrs. Wexley? Brenda's lips trembled. Senator Calloway, Vincent Harland, they run everything. The fake foster homes, the paperwork, all of it. She wrapped her arms around herself. I was just following orders. Samuel's jaw tightened. Beside him, Miriam made notes, her pen scratching furiously against paper. Get me a prosecutor, Brenda pleaded. I'll tell you everything. How they choose the kids, where the money goes, all of it. Within hours, federal prosecutors arrived. Arrest warrants were drafted and signed. Samuel watched the machinery of justice finally turn in the right direction. At 8:45 a.m., FBI teams stormed Vincent Harland's estate. The developer was found in his study, frantically shredding documents. They led him out in handcuffs, his face ashen. But Senator Calloway's mansion was empty. He's gone, Agent Chavez reported, frustration evident in her voice. Private jet took off last night. We're tracking possible destinations. Samuel stood in the parking lot as officers escorted Brenda Wexley to a waiting police car. She caught his eye as she passed, her face drawn and defeated. You did this, she spat, but there was no force behind it, just fear. Miriam stepped up beside Samuel, watching the police car drive away. We're not done yet, she said quietly, squeezing his shoulder. Calloway is still out there. Samuel nodded silently. One more battle remained. The federal courthouse buzzed with tension as reporters and spectators packed the benches. Samuel Carter stood tall in his dark suit, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes burning with determination. The morning sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Judge Henry Hensley sat at the bench, his fingers drumming nervously on the wooden surface. The weight of the decision before him showed clearly in the deep creases of his forehead. This hearing will come to order, Hensley announced, his voice echoing through the crowded courtroom. District Attorney Michael Reed rose first, straightening his tie. Your Honor, Judge Carter's actions were a clear violation of judicial conduct. He abandoned neutrality and inserted himself into an ongoing case. Miriam Grayson stood up slowly, her silver hair gleaming. With all due respect, what my colleague calls abandoning neutrality was actually standing up to systemic corruption. Judge Carter didn't just insert himself into a case. He exposed a criminal enterprise that reached the highest levels of our government. Reed's face reddened. That's speculation. We have procedures, protocols. Procedures? Miriam's voice cut like steel. The same procedures that allowed Senator Calloway to manipulate our courts? The same protocols that almost let them traffic an innocent child out of the country? The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Hensley banged his gavel. Ms. Grayson, please stick to the matter at hand, Judge Carter's suspension. This is the matter at hand, Miriam continued, pulling out a thick folder. I have here documented evidence of how Judge Carter's suspension was orchestrated by Calloway's people. Phone records, emails, money transfers, all proving this was political retaliation. Samuel watched as Judge Hensley's face grew increasingly troubled. The older judge had been his friend once, before politics and fear had driven a wedge between them. Suddenly, a commotion broke out at the back of the courtroom. Rachel DeWitt's latest article was making waves. Her phone had been buzzing nonstop with notifications. The story had gone viral, exposing more of Calloway's criminal network. Your Honor, Reed tried again, but his voice lacked conviction. We can't allow judges to become vigilantes, regardless of their intentions. No, Miriam agreed, her voice softer now. But we must allow them to be human, to recognize injustice when they see it, and to act when the system fails those it's meant to protect. Judge Hensley removed his glasses, rubbing his temples. The courtroom fell silent, waiting. Through the windows, they could hear the growing crowd outside, their chants for justice growing louder. Finally, Hensley spoke. "I find no grounds for continuing Judge Carter's suspension. He is hereby reinstated to the bench, effective immediately." The courtroom erupted in cheers. Samuel felt a weight lift from his shoulders as Miriam squeezed his arm in victory. Outside the courthouse steps, the bright morning sun warmed their faces as they emerged. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, but Samuel barely noticed them. He turned to Miriam, his expression determined. "Now let's finish this." The sterile hospital hallway seemed to stretch endlessly as Samuel and Miriam made their way to Yasmin's room. The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows, and the quiet beeping of medical equipment created a steady rhythm in the background. Samuel paused at the door, his hand hovering over the handle. Through the small window, he could see Yasmin Monroe propped up in her hospital bed, her face thin and tired, but her eyes alert. Alani sat in a chair nearby, fidgeting with the hem of her dress. "Ready?" Miriam asked softly. Samuel nodded and opened the door. The moment they entered, Yasmin's eyes filled with tears. Alani looked up, uncertain at first, then slowly walked toward her mother's bed. "Baby," Yasmin whispered, her voice cracking. She opened her arms, and Alani climbed onto the bed, burying her face in her mother's hospital gown. Yasmin held her daughter close, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Samuel and Miriam stood back, giving them space. The reunion was both beautiful and heartbreaking, months of separation ending in this sterile room, under the harsh fluorescent lights. After several minutes, Miriam stepped forward. "Ms. Monroe," she said gently, "I know this is overwhelming, but we need to talk about what happens next." Yasmin looked up, her arms still wrapped protectively around Alani. "They'll come after us again," she whispered. "Not if we stop them first," Miriam replied. She pulled up a chair and sat down. "But we need your help. We need you to testify about what they did to you." Fear flickered across Yasmin's face. "You don't know what they're capable of. Calloway, his people, they threatened to kill Alani if I didn't disappear." Samuel knelt beside the bed, meeting Yasmin's eyes. "They took everything from you. Don't let them take your voice." The room fell silent except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. Alani pressed closer to her mother, and Yasmin stroked her daughter's hair, lost in thought. Finally, Yasmin lifted her chin. "I'll testify," she said quietly. "I'll tell everything." Miriam immediately pulled out a notepad. "Let's start preparing your statement. We need to be thorough." As they began working, Rachel arrived to discuss the exclusive interview that would share Yasmin's story with the world. The room buzzed with purpose now, with hope. When it was time to leave, Samuel stood by the door, watching mother and daughter together. Alani slipped off the bed and walked over to him, her small face serious. "Thank you," she whispered, and those two simple words carried more weight than any legal victory ever could. The federal courthouse buzzed with tension as cameras flashed and reporters jostled for position. Samuel Carter sat at the bench, his black robes a stark contrast to the morning light streaming through the tall windows. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone present. Vincent Harland sat at the defense table. His expensive suit couldn't hide the nervous twitch in his jaw. His eyes darted between his lawyers and the door, like a trapped animal looking for escape. Yasmin Monroe walked to the witness stand, her steps slow but determined. Though still weak from her ordeal, her voice carried clearly through the packed courtroom as she raised her right hand to take the oath. "Ms. Monroe," Miriam began gently, "please tell the court what happened the night you confronted Mr. Harland about unpaid wages." Yasmin's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I went to his office. Other workers were afraid, but I had Alani to think about. He ... She paused, taking a deep breath. "He said if I kept pushing, I'd never see my daughter again. I didn't believe him. The next day, someone grabbed me outside my apartment. They drugged me." Harland's lawyer jumped up. "Objection, speculation about who was responsible." "Overruled," Samuel said firmly, his gavel punctuating the word. On a large screen mounted to the wall, Senator Callaway's face appeared via video link, his usual polished appearance somewhat disheveled. "This is nothing but a politically motivated attack," he declared, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Miriam presented document after document, financial records, text messages, surveillance photos. Harlan's face grew paler with each piece of evidence. During a brief recess, his lawyers huddled with prosecutors. "My client is willing to provide detailed testimony about Senator Callaway's involvement," Harlan's lead attorney announced when court resumed. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Samuel banged his gavel for order. Just then, Rachel DeWitt slipped into the courtroom, handing a folder to Miriam. Miriam's eyes widened as she reviewed the contents. Banking records showing millions flowing from Callaway's offshore accounts to shell companies involved in human trafficking. "This is a witch hunt," Callaway shouted through the video feed, his composure cracking. "You have no proof." "The evidence speaks for itself, Senator." Samuel cut him off, his voice sharp with authority. The jury took less than 2 hours to reach their verdict. As they filed back in, Harlan slumped in his chair, already knowing what was coming. Samuel looked down at the man who had caused so much pain. "Vincent Harland, you are found guilty of all charges." His gavel fell with finality. The crowd outside the courthouse erupted in cheers as Harland was led away in handcuffs, his shoulders sagging in defeat. The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of the federal courthouse's prosecution strategy room. Judge Samuel Carter stood at the head of a large oak table, his reinstated position giving him renewed purpose. Around him, papers and files covered every inch of the surface, each one a piece of evidence against Senator Richard Callaway. Miriam Grayson paced the room, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed documents. "Callaway's lawyers are desperate," she said, waving a motion filing. "They're throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks." FBI Special Agent Laura Chavez spread out a map marked with red pins. "We've tracked his movements through 3 states. He's burning through safe houses faster than we can track them." Rachel DeWitt sat in the corner, typing furiously on her laptop. "My sources just confirmed 3 more witnesses willing to testify about Callaway's direct orders to cover up trafficking operations." The district attorney, Michael Reed, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The public pressure had forced his hand, but everyone could see his reluctance. "The political implications of this trial are irrelevant," Miriam cut him off sharply. "We're talking about children's lives." The tension in the room peaked when Judge Hensley entered for the motion hearing. His face was drawn, the weight of the decision visible in the slump of his shoulders. Callaway's legal team presented their arguments, throwing around terms like witch hunt and political persecution. When it was their turn, Miriam stood, holding up Harlan's signed confession. "Your Honor, we have concrete evidence, bank records, witness statements, and now Vincent Harlan's full testimony detailing Senator Callaway's direct involvement in human trafficking operations." Samuel watched Hensley's face, seeing the internal struggle. He stood up, his voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench. "Henry," he said, using Hensley's first name, breaking protocol. "You've always stood for justice. Don't let fear of political consequences make you forget that now." The courtroom fell silent. Hensley's hands trembled slightly as he picked up his gavel. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "Motion to dismiss denied. This trial will proceed." Within hours, Callaway released his video statement. His face appeared on screens across the country, perfectly composed but with fear hiding behind his eyes. "This is nothing more than a radical attempt to destroy our country's institutions," he declared. Rachel's response was swift and devastating. Her latest report hit the wire services immediately. Detailed accounts from witnesses describing how Callaway had orchestrated multiple cover-ups, complete with dates, locations, and corroborating evidence. Federal marshals mobilized across state lines, following leads to luxury hideouts where Callaway had sought refuge. Each location turned up empty, but with evidence of recent occupation, they were getting closer. As Samuel walked down the courthouse steps that evening, he paused. The plaza was filled with protesters, their signs catching the late afternoon light. "Justice for Alani," they chanted. "Stop child trafficking." Others held photos of missing children, their faces a stark reminder of what this fight was really about. Standing there, Samuel felt the full weight of what lay ahead. He whispered to himself, "It's all or nothing now." The Federal Detention Center's interrogation room felt smaller than usual, its gray walls closing in as Vincent Harland was led inside in handcuffs. His designer suit had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit, his normally perfectly styled hair now disheveled. The fall from grace was written all over his face. Judge Samuel Carter sat straight-backed at the metal table, with Miriam Grayson beside him. Federal Prosecutor Jessica Monroe arranged her files methodically, her expression neutral but focused. "Mr. Harland," Samuel began, his voice steady, "you know why we're here." Harland's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "Come to gloat, Your Honor." "I came to offer you a chance," Samuel replied, leaning forward. "You help us take down Calloway, and maybe, just maybe, you see daylight again before you die." Harland let out a short laugh, but his eyes betrayed uncertainty. "You expect me to believe that?" Miriam slid a thick document across the table. "This is your plea agreement. Full confession, complete cooperation, in exchange for consideration during sentencing and protective custody." Harland's fingers drummed against the table as he stared at the papers. The room fell silent, except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. "I talk, and you guarantee me protection inside," Harland said finally, his voice losing its edge. Miriam nodded firmly. "You talk and we guarantee Calloway gets what he deserves." Harland closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them with resignation. "Get your recorder ready." For the next 2 hours, Harland detailed everything. Names spilled out like water from a broken dam. Corrupt judges, police chiefs, politicians. He described elaborate money laundering schemes, offshore accounts, and a network of trafficking operations that stretched across state lines. Jessica Monroe's pen flew across her notepad as federal agents in the observation room rushed to verify each revelation. Phone calls were made, databases searched, connections confirmed. "The night Yasmin Monroe confronted me about wages," Harland continued, "Calloway was already paranoid about whistleblowers. He ordered her taken care of. I made it happen." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he remained professional. "And Alani?" "Insurance," Harland replied quietly. "Keep the mother quiet by holding the daughter. It was Calloway's idea." As agents continued confirming Harland's statements, the full scope of Calloway's corruption emerged. Each piece of testimony matched existing evidence, filling in gaps investigators had struggled with for months. When the deposition was complete, Harland signed the official documents. Guards stepped forward to escort him back to his cell. At the doorway, Harland turned back to Samuel with a knowing smirk. "He won't go down quietly, Judge. You better be ready for the bloodbath." Samuel met his gaze steadily, unmoved. "We'll see about that." The federal courthouse's witness holding room felt both safe and suffocating. Sunlight filtered through bulletproof windows, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. Yasmin Monroe sat straight-backed in her chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap to hide their slight trembling. Beside her, little Alani pressed close, her small frame seeking comfort in her mother's presence. Judge Samuel Carter watched them both, noting how Yasmin's shoulders tensed whenever footsteps passed by the door. She was stronger now. The haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by something fiercer, more determined. But the fear still lingered. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Samuel asked gently. Yasmin glanced down at Alani, who looked up at her with those deep brown eyes that had seen too much. She took a deep breath. "I have to be. For her." Miriam Grayson pulled her chair closer, spreading out the preparation documents. "Let's go through it again. They'll start by asking about your employment at Harland's construction site." Yasmin nodded, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "I was working there for 3 months. When they stopped paying us, I confronted Mr. Harland directly. That's when the threats started." "And then?" Miriam prompted. "They followed me home, 2 men in suits. I tried reporting it to the police, but..." Yasmin's voice caught. "They said there was no evidence. Then one night I woke up to someone in my house. They had Alani. They said if I screamed, she pulled Alani closer. Samuel noticed how Alani didn't flinch at the story. She'd lived it after all. The little girl just held her mother's hand tighter. The hospital, Miriam continued. Tell us about waking up there. Everything was foggy. They kept me sedated. I heard them talking about Senator Calloway, about making sure I stayed quiet. They used a fake name for me, Jane Stevens, said I was a mental patient who needed isolation. As Yasmin spoke, Rachel DeWitt sat quietly in the corner taking notes. Her article would help ensure the public stayed invested, kept demanding justice. Miriam made another note on her legal pad. I'm filing for additional protection. We can't take any chances with Calloway's people still out there. Yasmin's hands shook slightly, but her voice remained firm. I won't let them silence me again. They took my daughter. They took my life. They don't get to take my voice too. Samuel knelt beside Alani, who had been watching everything with those wise beyond her years' eyes. Your mama's going to tell the world your story, he said softly. Alani's small fingers found his, gripping them with surprising strength. I know, she said simply. The safe house sat nestled in dense woods, its windows dark except for a single lamp casting shadows across Senator Richard Calloway's haggard face. His usually immaculate suit was wrinkled, his silver hair disheveled. He paced the room like a caged animal, each step heavy with desperate anger. Jackson Miles, his attorney, watched from an armchair, his briefcase open on the coffee table. Legal papers scattered across the surface told a story of rapid collapse, frozen accounts, seized assets, mounting evidence. Richard, you need to listen to me, Miles said, his voice tight with urgency. Every minute you stay here is another minute closer to arrest. I've arranged transport, a private plane, discreet landing strip, but we need to move now. Calloway stopped pacing, his fists clenched. I've spent 30 years building this. 30 years. And now some small-town judge thinks he can tear it all down? They have Harlan's testimony. They have the banking records. Your former associates are turning on you by the hour. Miles gathered the papers, stuffing them back into his briefcase. There's no winning this fight, not here. But Calloway wasn't listening. He pulled out his phone, fingers trembling slightly as he dialed a number he knew by heart. The line connected. Listen to me, he growled into the phone. If I go down, so do all of you. Every last one. Get me out of this. The response was silence, then a click. The line went dead. Calloway stared at the phone in disbelief. Behind him, a news anchor's voice drifted from the television. Breaking news. Federal agents are reportedly closing in on Senator Richard Calloway's location. Reality finally seemed to hit him. He grabbed a duffel bag, yanking it open. Stacks of cash went in first, followed by passports and documents. Sir, Miles warned, moving toward the window. We need to... The night exploded with red and blue lights. Police sirens wailed, their sound growing closer. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness outside. Calloway froze, the bag dropping from his hands. Cash spilled across the floor as a commanding voice boomed through a megaphone. Senator Calloway, come out with your hands up. His jaw clenched, teeth grinding together. This couldn't be happening. Not to him. Not after everything. The front door burst inward with a thunderous crash. Armed agents flooded the room, weapons raised, voices shouting commands that blurred together. Rough hands grabbed him, forcing him to the ground. Cold metal handcuffs clicked around his wrists. As his face pressed against the hardwood floor, Senator Richard Calloway, once one of the most powerful men in the state, finally understood. His reign was over. The federal courthouse buzzed with tension as crowds gathered outside, their signs demanding justice visible through the tall windows. Inside, the historic courtroom was packed to capacity, reporters sketching furiously in their notepads while photographers jostled for position. Judge Samuel Carter sat at the bench, his face etched with determination. The weight of countless eyes pressed down on him, but his focus remained steady. To his right, Miriam Grayson arranged her documents with practiced precision, her silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The double doors swung open, A collective gasp rippled through the gallery as Senator Richard Callaway shuffled in, chains clinking with each step. His designer suits were replaced by an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his frame. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. His shoulders slumped in defeat. Yasmin Monroe sat in the front row, her daughter Alani's small hand clasped tightly in hers. Their presence seemed to physically affect Callaway. His step faltered when he passed them. Federal Prosecutor Jessica Monroe rose, her voice clear and unwavering. The evidence will show that Senator Callaway orchestrated a criminal enterprise spanning decades, trafficking vulnerable individuals for profit and power. Miriam presented Vincent Harlan's testimony methodically, letting each damning detail sink in. Banking records flashed across screens, offshore accounts, shell companies, all leading back to Callaway. The defense attorney's objections grew increasingly desperate as document after document revealed the senator's corruption. When Yasmin took the stand, the room fell silent. Her voice trembled at first but grew stronger as she spoke. They drugged me, kept me sedated, all because I demanded fair wages for workers. She described waking up in strange facilities, being moved whenever she showed signs of awareness. They tried to erase me, to take my daughter away forever. Alani squeezed her mother's hand tighter, tears rolling down her small cheeks. Samuel noticed Callaway's jaw clenching, his first real show of emotion. Miriam's closing statement cut through the tension like a blade. Senator Callaway didn't just break laws, he broke families. He didn't just commit crimes, he destroyed lives. He treated human beings like commodities, children like bargaining chips, and justice like a game he could rig. The jury filed out, their faces grim. Samuel studied Callaway from the bench. The senator's trademark arrogance had crumbled, replaced by something raw and unfamiliar. Fear. For the first time, Richard Callaway looked truly vulnerable, finally understanding that his money and power couldn't save him anymore. The federal courthouse fell silent as the jury filed back into the courtroom. Judge Samuel Carter watched their faces carefully, searching for any hint of their decision. His hands, usually steady on the bench, trembled slightly. Yasmin Monroe squeezed Alani's small hand, drawing her daughter closer. The little girl's eyes darted between her mother and the jury, understanding even at her young age that something important was happening. Senator Richard Callaway stood stiffly at the defense table, his expensive suit now wrinkled from hours of sitting. The arrogance that had defined him for decades had crumbled, replaced by a hollow-eyed stare. Miriam Grayson leaned forward in her seat, her weathered hands clasped tightly together. She'd fought countless battles in this courthouse, but none quite like this. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Samuel's voice carried through the hushed room. The jury foreperson, a middle-aged woman with steel-gray hair, rose slowly. Her hands shook as she held the paper. "We have, Your Honor." The paper rustled in the silence. The foreperson cleared her throat. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit human trafficking." She paused, her voice growing stronger. "We find the defendant guilty." A soft gasp rippled through the courtroom. Callaway's shoulders stiffened. "On the charge of corruption and abuse of power, we find the defendant guilty." Yasmin pulled Alani closer, tears streaming down her face. "On the charge of attempted obstruction of justice, we find the defendant guilty." Callaway's head dropped, his carefully maintained facade finally cracking. His attorneys immediately jumped up, papers rustling as they prepared their appeals. Samuel's gavel cracked through their protests. "The court thanks the jury for their service." His voice grew harder as he turned to Callaway. "The defendant will rise for sentencing." Callaway stood mechanically, his eyes fixed on some distant point. "Senator Richard Callaway, your actions have demonstrated a complete disregard for human dignity and the law you swore to uphold. This court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." Outside, the crowd's cheers echoed through the courthouse walls as the news spread. Yasmin wrapped her arms around Alani, her tears falling freely now. "It's over, baby. It's finally over." Samuel watched as federal marshals led Callaway away. Years of fighting corruption, of standing up against seemingly impossible odds, had led to this moment. He stepped outside into the late afternoon sun, the weight of the case finally lifting from his shoulders. Miriam fell into step beside him, a rare grin spreading across her face. "You did it, Judge Carter." Samuel shook his head, looking at his old friend. "We did it." The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the family court, casting a warm glow across the wooden benches. Judge Samuel Carter adjusted his robes, taking a deep breath before entering the courtroom. This hearing was different from any he'd presided over before. It wasn't about fighting corruption or exposing criminals. Today was about healing, about making a family whole again. Yasmin Monroe sat in the front row, her dark hair neatly pulled back, wearing a simple blue dress that made her look younger, more hopeful. Beside her, Alani fidgeted in her chair, her small legs swinging back and forth. The little girl wore a yellow ribbon in her hair, a gift from Miriam Grayson, who sat on their other side, legal papers organized neatly before her. "All rise," the bailiff called out as Samuel entered. The small gathering stood. This wasn't a public spectacle like Calloway's trial. This was intimate, personal. Samuel took his seat and smiled warmly at Alani, who gave a tiny wave in return. "We're here today," he began, his voice gentle, "to finalize the custody arrangement for Alani Monroe and to officially reinstate the full parental rights of Yasmin Monroe." He picked up the final order, the paper carrying the weight of so many battles fought and won. "Having reviewed all evidence and circumstances, this court finds that it is in the best interest of the child to be returned to the full custody of her biological mother, Yasmin Monroe." Tears began streaming down Yasmin's face as she squeezed Alani's hand. The little girl leaned against her mother's arm, a small smile playing on her lips. "Furthermore," Samuel continued, "all previous orders regarding custody are hereby vacated. Ms. Monroe's parental rights are fully restored, effective immediately." Miriam reached over and squeezed Yasmin's shoulder. "It's done," she whispered. "You're both safe now." After signing the final documents, Samuel stepped down from the bench. Miriam approached with news that made Yasmin's eyes widen. "The Survivors Justice Initiative wants you to join their legal advocacy team," she explained. "They help people who've been through similar situations. They think your experience could make a real difference." Yasmin wiped her eyes, overwhelmed. I never thought I'd be able to help others." Samuel approached them, his robes rustling softly. "You're stronger than you know, Yasmin. What you've been through, what you've overcome, that strength could light the way for others." Alani looked up at him, her brown eyes bright and clear. "Thank you, Judge Carter," she said softly, the words carrying all the innocent sincerity of a child who understood, in her own way, just how much this man had fought for her. Samuel watched as they gathered their belongings, ready to step into their new life together. Yasmin held Alani's hand tightly, as if still afraid someone might try to separate them again. But there was hope in her steps now, determination in her shoulders. As they walked toward the courtroom doors, the morning sunlight caught them, surrounding mother and daughter in a warm glow. Samuel stood quietly, knowing that while their journey would have its challenges, they finally had what they'd been fighting for, a chance to be together, to heal, to build something new. The morning sun painted Samuel's kitchen in soft golden hues as he stirred his coffee, lost in thought. His house felt different now, quieter, yet somehow fuller with meaning after everything that had happened. The teddy bear from the empty facility sat on his counter, a reminder of how close they'd come to losing Alani forever. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. When he opened the door, his heart squeezed at the sight of Alani standing there, wearing a bright yellow dress and holding a small paper bag. Behind her, Yasmin waited by their packed car, offering a warm smile. "Judge Carter," Alani said softly, holding out the bag. "I brought you something." Samuel knelt down to her level, accepting the gift with careful hands. Inside was her old teddy bear, worn and loved, with one ear slightly crooked. His throat tightened as she explained, "So you don't forget me." "Oh, sweetheart," he said, his voice rough with emotion. I could never forget you, Alani. Never. She threw her arms around his neck in a fierce hug. Samuel held her close, remembering how small and scared she'd been that first day in his courtroom. Now she stood tall, her eyes bright with hope instead of fear. Yasmin approached, her hand resting gently on Alani's shoulder. We're heading out. Just wanted to say thank you one more time. She paused, searching for words. What you did for us. There's no way we can ever repay you. Samuel shook his head. Seeing you both safe and together? That's all the payment I need. They said their goodbyes and Samuel watched as they climbed into their car. Alani waved from the back window until they turned the corner and disappeared from view. He stood there for a long moment, the teddy bear clutched in his hands. The sound of footsteps made him turn. Miriam walked up his driveway, a knowing smile on her face. She took one look at his tear-filled eyes and said, You okay, old man? Samuel let out a chuckle, wiping his eyes. For the first time in a long while, yeah, I really am. He walked back inside, placing the teddy bear carefully on his shelf. It would stay there, a reminder not just of Alani, but of why he'd become a judge in the first place. To protect those who needed protection, to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. For the first time in years, Samuel Carter felt truly at peace. Samuel sat at his desk, methodically sorting through stacks of paperwork. The morning light streamed through his office window, casting long shadows across case files and legal documents. His eyes kept drifting to the teddy bear perched on the corner of his desk, Alani's final gift before leaving for their fresh start. A thick report landed on his desk with a thud. Several high-ranking officials connected to Callaway, and Harland had resigned overnight. Some were already under federal investigation. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Rachel DeWitt strode into his office, her laptop tucked under her arm. Judge Carter, thought you'd want to see this before it goes live. She turned the screen toward him, revealing her final article headline, Justice Served, the Case That Shook the Nation. Nice title, Samuel said, managing a small smile. Miriam pushed through the door moments later, juggling 3 coffee cups. When's the last time you actually took a break, Sam? She set one cup in front of him, the rich aroma filling the room. Who has time for breaks? Samuel replied, though he gratefully accepted the coffee. Detective Keller appeared in the doorway, his expression lighter than it had been in months. Thought you'd want updates. Harlan's settled into maximum security. No special treatment. Brenda Wexley got 25 years, no possibility of early release. And Callaway? He grinned. Appeal rejected. He's not going anywhere. Samuel nodded, satisfaction warming his chest. But before he could respond, his eyes caught sight of a small envelope on his desk, addressed in careful handwriting. Inside, he found a photograph. Alani's bright smile beamed up at him as she clutched a new teddy bear. A note accompanied the picture. Because of you, I still believe in good people. Miriam watched his expression soften as he held the photograph. She didn't need to see it to know who it was from. Rachel closed her laptop slowly. We won this battle, she said, her voice serious. But corruption is never fully gone. There's always another fight. Samuel placed the photograph carefully on his desk, right next to Alani's teddy bear. He looked at his assembled allies, now friends, and nodded firmly. Then we'll be ready for it. The grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel buzzed with the low murmur of conversation as hundreds of judges and legal professionals gathered for the annual judicial conference. Samuel Carter stood at the podium, his hands resting lightly on its edges as he surveyed the crowd. The familiar faces of his peers looked back at him, some eager, others guarded. We failed, Samuel began, his voice clear and steady. We failed Alani Monroe. We failed her mother, and we're failing countless others every single day. A ripple of discomfort moved through the audience. Some judges straightened in their chairs, while others looked down at their hands. For decades, I believed in the system. I defended it. I upheld it. Samuel paused, letting his words sink in. But what good is a system that protects the powerful while crushing the vulnerable? What good are our laws if they can be bought and sold? In the front row, Miriam Grayson nodded encouragingly. Her presence gave him strength, as it had throughout the entire Calloway case. The truth is, Samuel continued, we've become so focused on procedure that we've forgotten about justice. We've become so concerned with precedent that we've forgotten about people. Several older judges shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Samuel could almost hear their unspoken protests about tradition and protocol. After the speech, Judge Henry Hensley approached him in the hallway. His face was drawn with concern. Sam, I understand your frustration, but the system needs people like you. Good people. Strong people. Samuel shook his head, feeling the weight of years of compromise and disappointment. The system needs to change, and that won't happen from this bench. Later, Samuel and Miriam sat on a bench outside the hotel, watching the city traffic flow past. The spring air was crisp, carrying the promise of change. I have something for you to consider, Miriam said, pulling out a folder. State University Law School. They're looking for someone to teach ethics and criminal justice reform. Samuel raised an eyebrow. Teaching? Training the next generation, Miriam corrected. Showing them how to fight the right battles, how to recognize corruption, how to stand up when everyone else sits down. I've only ever been on this side of the fight, Samuel admitted, uncertainty creeping into his voice. Miriam smirked, her eyes twinkling with that familiar fire. Then maybe it's time to try the other side. Samuel stood up, walking to the edge of the sidewalk. The city stretched out before him, the courthouse where he'd spent his career, the streets where justice had been both served and denied. He took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he saw a different path ahead. The morning sun filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the empty benches of Courtroom 3. Samuel Carter stood in the doorway, his hand lingering on the polished wooden doorframe. For 42 years, this room had been his sanctuary, his battlefield, his home. He walked slowly down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Each creak of the floorboards brought back memories, thousands of cases, countless faces, moments of triumph and heartbreak. The American flag hung still in the corner, its stars and stripes watching over the empty gallery. At the bench, Samuel ran his fingers along the smooth wood, worn smooth by decades of use. His nameplate caught the morning light, the Honorable Samuel Carter, soon to be removed and replaced. The door opened softly behind him. Rebecca Hayes stood there, clutching a stack of papers to her chest, her eyes already glistening with tears. I brought the last of the transfer paperwork, she said, her voice wavering, though I kept putting it off as long as I could. Samuel smiled warmly at his clerk. 15 years you've been keeping me organized, Rebecca. This place won't fall apart without me. It won't be the same, she insisted, setting the papers down. Who else will bring donuts every Friday, or know exactly which legal precedent to cite without looking it up? Before Samuel could respond, Miriam Grayson's distinctive footsteps clicked across the floor. She carried a single manila folder. Getting sentimental in your old age, Sam? She asked, but her tone was gentle. She tossed the folder onto his desk. The teaching contract. They need an answer today. Samuel picked up the contract, feeling its weight in his hands. Law professor at Georgetown, shaping young minds instead of passing judgment. A different kind of justice. The students won't know what hit them, Miriam added with a smile. Without hesitation, Samuel pulled out his pen, the same one he'd used to sign countless rulings, and signed his name on the dotted line. I suppose I should see what kind of trouble I can stir up in a classroom. Rebecca couldn't hold back any longer. She rushed forward and hugged him tightly. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Then she hurried out, wiping her eyes. Samuel walked the perimeter of his courtroom one last time. He touched the witness stand where Yasmin Monroe had found her voice, the gallery where protesters had demanded justice, the bench where he'd sentenced Richard Calloway. Miriam watched him silently, understanding the weight of this moment. Samuel straightened his tie, adjusted his jacket, and took one final look at the room that had defined his career. Then he reached for the light switch. He turned off the lights, closed the door, and walked away without looking back. The lecture hall buzzed with nervous energy as Samuel Carter adjusted his tie, standing before rows of fresh-faced law students. Their eager expressions reminded him of his own first days in law school, decades ago. But he wasn't here to teach them dusty legal precedents or constitutional amendments. He was here for something far more important. Miriam Grayson slipped quietly into the back row, her eyes twinkling with amusement. She knew exactly what Samuel had planned for these unsuspecting students. "Good morning," Samuel began, his voice carrying the same authority it had held in his courtroom. "I'm Professor Carter, but some of you might know me better as Judge Carter." A few whispers rippled through the room. His case against Senator Callaway had made national headlines. He turned to the whiteboard and wrote 3 simple words: "What is justice?" Turning back to face the class, he leaned against the podium. "Let me ask you a question. It's the same question I asked myself every day for 42 years on the bench." He gestured to the words behind him. "What is justice?" The students shifted uncomfortably. Some reached for their notebooks. Others stared blankly ahead. Samuel waited, letting the silence stretch. "Anyone?" he prompted. "Come on, you're all here to practice law. Surely someone can tell me what justice means?" A few tentative hands rose. Standard textbook answers followed. Equal treatment under the law, fair punishment for crimes, protection of rights. Samuel shook his head. "Those are definitions. I'm asking what justice means." He stepped away from the podium, walking between the rows of desks. When a child is taken from her mother through corruption and lies, what does justice mean then? The room grew still. In the back, Miriam smiled, knowing Samuel was in his element. "If you don't have an answer, don't worry," Samuel continued, his voice softening. "By the time we're done, you will. Because justice isn't just about laws and precedents. It's about people. Real people, with real lives at stake." As discussion began to flow, voices growing more confident, one particular voice cut through the others from the back of the room. Clear, determined, familiar. Samuel turned toward the sound, and his heart skipped a beat. There sat Alani Monroe, no longer the frightened 6-year-old he'd saved, but a young woman with the same determined look in her eyes. She was taking notes, her hand raised to join the debate. Samuel smiled, truly smiled, for the first time that morning. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that his fight had never been in vain. The torch was being passed to a new generation, and they would carry it forward with the same passion for justice that had driven him all these years. If you enjoyed the story of Miriam, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.